already that I sent. And let's see. How are we looking for attendance? 21. Okay.
Yeah, we can start. I will open the class in the Bahasa Indonesia, yeah, Raj.
Yeah, boleh boleh. In it there you can see my title in Indonesian and
okay, masalah jahat dan dalam beradaptasi dengan lingkungan.
Yeah, that's
perubahan iklim dan studi kasus India Selatan. Okay.
I don't know if masalah jahat is the right way to translate wicked, but anyway, we can have a discussion.
It's between, you know, so you can describe it later on. Ya, selamat sore saudara-saudara sekalian, Pak Raj dan mahasiswa yang saya cintai. Pada hari ini kita kembali akan mendengarkan kuliah dari Pak Raj mengenai dalam bahasa Inggrisnya The Difficult Problem of Adapting to Climate Change Impact, a case study from Southern India, atau dalam bahasa Indonesia masalah jahat di antara tanda kutip dalam beradaptasi dengan dampak perubahan iklim, sebuah studi kasus dari India Selatan. Kajian Pak Raj ini sangat bermanfaat karena ini sangat terkait dan sangat komprehensif. Jadi harapan saya saudara-saudara menyimak dengan baik. Saya atas nama Pak Budi Gunawan yang tidak bisa hadir pada hari ini akan menggantikan Pak Budi karena Pak Budi ada rapat yang tidak bisa ditinggalkan. Dan Pak Budi juga memohon saudara-saudara tetap memperhatikan presentasi kelas dari Pak Raj hari ini. Terima kasih. And besides, there's not only the student from the undergraduate, but there are also people from postgraduate student here again. Okay, your time is now, Raj.
Okay, terima kasih semua. Selamat datang ke presentasi ini. I gave a similar talk about a year and a half ago, and but I'm framing it slightly different now, and I have a little bit more information to impart about my case study in India. But since this is the course in ecological anthropology, and we're talking about practice, that is the practice of doing ecological anthropology, what it's like, I'll talk a little bit about methods and how we go about doing this kind of research. So part of this lecture is about the methods we use to understand complexity. And climate change is a complex thing, not only because it has many, many unexpected consequences and involves many things and is global, but at the same time very local. It interacts with everything else that we are familiar with, whether it's culture, society, our values, religion. It affects everything in a complicated way, but it's also not the only thing that is happening in the world, right? And I suppose the COVID pandemic sort of illustrates that, you know, and the war in Ukraine and the impacts of war on energy worries, right? So the problems with the distribution of natural gas in Europe now, the effects of blockades on the export of grain. We know you had the oil palm issues in Indonesia, and in India also they stopped exporting grain. So there's so many different complicating factors that are going around that affect people, not just climate change. And that's one of the big messages I want to say to you today, that anthropologists are very well placed to emphasize the fact that, and this is a kind of simplification, but always true, we human beings do things for many reasons, not just one, right? So climate change is one thing, but there are lots of other things going on in people's lives. And it's how these things interact that I'm interested in. That's what we mean by complexity. Now, so for this project, I learned how to graze cattle. I don't know if that's exactly the best way to translate it, mengembalakan ternak, but I had, in Indonesia, I was working with the Penan and the Kenya. They have some domesticated babi and a few ayam, and maybe some kambing here and there. But I'd never worked in a community that was really pastoralist or really depended on things like cattle as I did in India. So that was a new experience for me. And I really enjoyed it. I really liked learning how to graze cattle in the forests of India. So there's a picture of me with my piece of technology, which is a good stout stick. That's all you need to graze cattle, especially these, because they kind of graze themselves, really, which was an interesting thing that I learned, because I was asking people, well, where do cattle go? And I mean, where do you take your cattle? And they would say, well, the cattle take us. Many times, they know where to go. They know where to find food, and they will really, in many ways, they will return home eventually in the day. So learning how to graze cattle was really fun and interesting. And it's one of the great things about anthropology. We go out there and live with different kinds of people and experience different things, and we learn different things. And through trying things, through participating, we really get a sense of what it's like to live somebody else's life, really.
Pak Raj, can
Yeah.
I disturb you for a second? Your slide is, I think, so small. Can you do it and slide?
Can you see the?
Yes, but it is. What do you? How do you do? Yeah.
Like that.
Yeah, that's it. That's
okay.
it.
Okay. I didn't think you could see, presenter.
Thank you. Sorry for disturbing you.
Okay, sorry, I just had to close the window. So, okay. So, so this is what we're going to talk about today, which is studying complexity and how we do it ethnographically, like an anthropologist. So I'm going to talk a little bit about anthropology and climate change today. That is, what are anthropologists doing with regard to climate change studies? And then how do we study the way that people are responding to the impacts of climate change, given the fact that climate change interacts with lots of other things? And through that, I will talk about research in India. And then finally, how do we generally work with the complexity of changing and dynamic human-environment relationships, which are the focus of ecological anthropology? Okay, let's see. All right, well, here is a diagram of climate change building. And what I want you to take from this is that if you think of it as a house, it has many floors and many things in each floor. And it's very complicated, as you can see. It involves the science of documenting climate impacts or the causes of it, the economic implications, the effects on society, the attempts through law and governance to manage, adapt, or mitigate. And you'll see across the top the two roofs of climate change: adaptation and mitigation. And you're probably familiar with these terms. Mitigation is to try and stop the causes of climate change, like carbon capture or reduction in emissions, REDD, etc. So all of that international, the Kyoto Protocol, the Paris agreements are mitigation. Adaptation is, as I'll say, often people don't really like to talk about adaptation. And it's getting more and more attention now, because many of the underdeveloped or developing countries and economies want compensation to pay for adaptation. But people who work in mitigation don't really want to talk about adaptation because they see it as a failure in the sense of just accepting that things are changing and now we have to adapt to them. So that's a particular attitude that you'll find within the climate change discourse. Okay, so I've called climate change a wicked problem, masala jahat. It's wicked because it, as I've said here, it's a complicated kind of thing that is difficult to even define, like what's the problem actually, and how do we get a handle on it, and maybe doesn't have a solution. So here I've given you some of the characteristics. Difficult to define. There's a lot of interdependencies and it's caused by lots of things. When we try and pose solutions, it may have unintended consequences. There is no clear solution. It's socially complex. It involves changing human behavior, not necessarily just technology. And it cuts across many disciplinary and organizational boundaries. That makes it very difficult. And it seems intractable. That is, no matter what we do in terms of policies, doesn't seem to have much effect. And as we've noted, we've known about climate change for a while, and people have been trying to deal with it for the past 50 years, and the temperature has just continued to rise. The amount of emissions just continued to rise. So we have very, very rarely put a dent in the major indicators we have of global warming, which is the amount of CO2 going into the atmosphere. Now, people have defined what they call the wicked seven. These are the kinds of things: climate collapse, inequality, extremism, war, corruption, health and livelihood, population and migration. Now, these are the seven wicked problems that have been given as particularly intractable, very hard to come up with solutions. And okay, so with that context, how do anthropologists approach climate change? And what is it that we can offer to everyone else in the climate change science world in terms of anthropological research? And here are three characteristics that we identified that anthropologists are very good at. And I've given you an Indonesian translation there if you're not quite sure what I'm saying. But because anthropologists study values and political relations that shape climate-related knowledge creation and interpretation and form the basis of responses. So we have a lot of anthropologists doing research, for instance, in the IPCC, in the actual international bodies that are making decisions about climate change. And there is this whole kind of area of research about how these decisions are made. How do all the scientists agree or disagree about the data on climate change, et cetera? So there's the process of climate change science that anthropologists can take a step back and reflect on and do research on. And this is quite interesting because we know that knowledge and power are closely related. If we go back to Foucault and the basic tenets of the postmodern movement, and we know that the production of knowledge is quite controversial. And the IPCC, of course, is an intergovernmental panel. And all the countries that signed up to the IPCC have to sign off on the executive summaries and other documents. And so scientists don't really get the last word here. They have to produce documents that countries will sign off on or agree with. So that means there's always a bit of politics involved in a lot of the science we think are neutral science and objective scientific documents. Now, The other thing that anthropology can provide, and especially if we think of anthropology as including archaeology, as we do in the United States, perhaps less so here in the UK where I am. But if archaeology and anthropology are seen together, then we have the long-term perspective, the historical, the evolutionary perspective, and we can look our research on the way other societies and civilizations over time have dealt with climate change and climate variation can be useful. And also for any particular area, again, the historical contexts are going to affect climate change and the way people respond to climate change, right? So heavily colonized areas of the world are going to have a kind of post-colonial context in which to deal with climate change. Anyway, so, and then finally, I think, which is really speaks to a lot of what I'm talking about in this paper, is the fact that because anthropologists take a broad, holistic view of human and natural systems, we recognize that climate change is not the only thing going on. There are cultural, social, political, and economic changes that are affecting people as well. And these kinds of societal dynamics sometimes are more important than climate change, but they certainly interact. And so I think anthropologists can, again, describe and recognize the complexity in human societies as we try and come up with solutions or responses or policies to deal with climate change. Okay, so what are some of the topics that people are doing research today in terms of climate change? Obviously, we, as anthropologists, we like to do participant observation. We like to get on the ground and stay with people and live with them and experience what they're experiencing. So that kind of direct engagement with people, kind of like being a witness, is, I think, a huge and very valuable contribution that anthropologists can make. And you'll see that I think that really comes through in our research because until you really observe and stay with people, you don't really know what they're doing. I'm a skeptic when it comes to questionnaires. So within that, then there are various kinds of topics that people are pursuing. They're studying knowledge that people have of how the climate is changing. They're studying the way people are responding to particular kinds of impacts, whether it's melting glaciers or increased drought or heat or changes in flowering and fruiting or hurricane strength, etc. They're studying the way traditional knowledge interacts with scientific knowledge, the way global environmental policy affects local people and vice versa. Okay, and then a second set of research is addressing the underlying human causes of climate change. And there, anthropologists are doing research on consumer culture, what drives people to use so much carbon, whether it's in petrol, fuel for your car, or for other products. How does agriculture really contribute to emissions of carbon and greenhouse gases like methane? And also looking at the non-governmental organizations themselves and their arguments for behavioral change. So there's a lot of research that can be done within anthropology on various aspects of climate change. You'll remember last time we spoke, we talked about discourse in the environmental movement. And of course, there's that whole approach to understanding climate change. That is a sort of deconstructing the discourse and representations of nature and culture. Why is it that people are so preoccupied with climate change? We can also look at the underlying environmentalism, such as like studying Extinction Rebellion. We can look at things like dangerous climate change, various kinds of concepts that are being thrown around, like net zero. That's the latest, isn't it? And studying climate change deniers. So there's all this kind of aspect of research. Then there's the whole discourse on adaptation, which is what I focus on. People are doing research on the way that many indigenous peoples or local communities are represented as poor and vulnerable, which is equivalent to often the same discourse we hear with regard to underdevelopment and poverty. So the same kinds of labeling of particular groups of people in society, therefore justifying help, whether it's development or etc., aid. And there are a lot of indigenous peoples and a lot of local people everywhere who don't want to be represented as poor and vulnerable in that way, and therefore incapable of helping themselves. There's also a whole discussion about the limits to adaptation and adaptation pathways, which I'll talk about a little bit later. And then, of course, there's this idea of studying up. That is, up the hierarchy, studying people in power, people making policy decisions. That is, at the various UN international bodies and within the countries as well, looking at negotiations, diplomacy, and how knowledge is produced in all of these things. And so trying to understand concepts like the Green New Deal or the new green economy, net zero emissions, nature-based solutions, these are all trendy concepts and policy areas that have evolved. And as an anthropologist, we can deconstruct these, we can look at how they're being used and manipulated politically to understand the kinds of decisions people are making with regard to how much money they spend and where they put their money. And often that's what a lot of this is about, isn't it? It's about where does one put resources, i.e. funds, in terms of climate change. Right. I just wanted to alert you to the Journal of Ethnobiology, which has a recent issue on indigenous peoples and climate change impacts. And there's seven case studies there. Oops. I'll just go back. 7 case studies there of how indigenous people and local communities are responding to adaptation. And I thought that might be of interest to those of you more interested in ethnobotany, ethnobiology, as well as more specifically, as opposed to more generally, ecological anthropology. And you'll see there are various journal issues coming out now on various aspects of climate change. So as I said, climate change, what I've been doing research now on is adaptation. And this is a classic and old topic in anthropology. How do people adapt to something that is changing in their environment? Could be social, could be cultural, could be ecological. And so we talk about it in terms of adjustment in natural or human systems in response to actual or expected climatic stimuli or their effects, which moderates harm or exploits beneficial opportunities. And that's the way the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change defines adaptation. Anthropologists often think of adaptation in genetic terms, human adaptation over long evolutionary periods, or cultural adaptation at shorter time scales. We also have individual adaptation. We all, as individuals or as families, adapt to different situations. So we cope with crises on a daily basis. And so depending on the scale that we're talking about, whether we're talking about a single person's adaptation to their current situation, or families or communities or the species as a whole, we're talking about different kinds of adaptation. Obviously, for the developing world, the effects of climate change are going to be harder to adapt to there's just less resources and infrastructure and technology to help. And so we can expect really that those countries will be finding it much more difficult and will need help in doing so. All right, now there are several different kinds of adaptation that are going on. This is a page from the Adaptation Fund. And the Adaptation Fund is an international body set up through the World Bank. And you can go here and look at all the projects that Indonesia has proposed. So this is governments now. Governments ask for money and they from the Adaptation Fund, and there's like 15 billion in it every year. And this is an example of a project from India. And it's very typical, I would say, in that what it's asking for is extra money to climate proof, to climate proof an agricultural project. That is to, again, to increase the resilience of development. And that's very typical. So in this case, they've gotten a lot of money that goes to government organizations to climate proof a particular watershed thing in Tamil Nadu, watershed development. And the nice thing about the Adaptation Fund is they put all their documents online. You can see all of the proposals. You can see all of the reports, the final reports, and you get a sense. And you could actually do, and I want to do this. You could do a really good review article on adaptation in Indonesia if you just went to the Adaptation Fund and looked at all of the projects that have been funded, because they're very transparent. And so have a look at that sometime. And it could involve actually visiting the sites of where these projects are taking place and seeing to what extent they're actually implemented. I mean, you can kind of deconstruct and look at the language being used and what the Indonesian government is doing and proposing, but actually then going to the ground, which is what we do as anthropologists, to see what's actually happening would be useful. So for every international policy domain, like climate change adaptation, there is always a grassroots equivalent. And this is known now as community-based adaptation to climate change, or CBA. And there are conferences, as you can see here, on this held every year. Many of them have been organized through IIED, which is based in London, the International Institute for Environment and Development, but there's many organizations that have formed. And these are networks that link communities to communities. And they share information about how they're adapting to changes in their environments that might be caused by climate change. So you think about all the islands in the Pacific or in Indonesia that might be subject to sea level rise as a result of climate change. And a network could be established amongst all those communities where they share their experiments or the kinds of things they're doing to, say, protect their agriculture from saltwater incursion or preventing storm surge during storms on their islands by building seawalls or whatever. So this is kind of the grassroots level compared to the international level in terms of adaptation. And here's an example of a sort of independent, this one's called the Arctic Adaptation Exchange. And there's several organizations, and they are literally connecting individuals and organizations focused on the North. So where we have melting ice, so this links communities, practitioners, and academia to share information about how they're adapting to things like melting ice, warming temperatures, changes in fish and mammals, et cetera, et cetera. So again, this is community-based adaptation, grassroots responses to climate change. and the need to adapt and share experiences and information. This is sort of now moving into a little bit of ecological anthropology and what we can do. So I think, anyway, this is my idea, is that working together, always working together, right? Transdisciplinary, working with government, non-governmental organizations, and communities, we can, as collectives, as multidisciplinary teams, we can better understand the these dynamic and complex human ecosystems by linking fine-grained ethnographic research with causal analysis. And I'll talk about both of those two. Obviously, you're familiar with participant observation and fine-grained ethnographic research, maybe not causal analysis, and I'll show you why that's really important. Because what we're interested in, of course, is to understand how people are responding to climate and environmental change and why. So that's what I think the main question is here. In terms of adaptation, I don't use the word adaptation here. I just say responding, because I think that's a little bit more general. So how are people responding to climate and environmental change, and why? That, to me, is the question, the big question of our time. As anthropologists, we study people in communities, and we can observe and talk to them about what they're doing. And so, again, we are kind of witnesses to how people are adapting at the community level, at the ground. And so that's what led to my research in India. We wanted to know how people are responding to changes in their environment, such as invasive species. Now, many of you have heard of Lantana camera. I think it's in parts of Flores and eastern Indonesia, certainly drier areas, the dry tropics. And Lantana is partially, again, it's a complex relationship between people and Lantana. Lantana is an invasive species. It was introduced. It spread throughout India. It's spread for different reasons. And we think that climate change is increasing its ability to spread. And then it has multiple impacts. So this kind of a change is part of what we find now. One of the impacts of climate change, of course, is the impact on biodiversity. And of course, amongst conservationists, amongst people like Extinction Rebellion and other NGOs, that's a big focus. They claim we're in the middle of the 6th mass extinction, and we're losing species. The polar bears are threatened, and various kinds of habitats. We're losing diversity. But at the same time, there have been other kinds of changes that are going on, like pest explosions. We've had certainly what's called the pine beetle, the great northern pine beetle, which has destroyed millions of hectares of pine trees in British Columbia and Canada and in parts of Russia. We have invasive species, which we've had for a long time, but they're also facilitated. They're moving around. And then we have these shifts in range. So we have species moving up mountains as the weather gets warmer, plants and animals that are really comfortable at a certain temperature, having to move upwards in altitude or up in latitude. And I've got a picture there of a squid underneath the polar bear. And squid like particularly, colder waters. And as the waters off of Spain and Portugal and France here in Europe have gotten warmer, the squid have moved up, and they're now off the coast of Scotland, which is great for us in the UK because there's lots of cheap squid. But fish are moving all over the world as a result of warming sea temperatures. We also know that springtime in the temperate zone is coming earlier and earlier. So the cherry blossoms in Japan or in Washington, D.C. are coming earlier than normal, and therefore it's causing massive shifts in these celebrations and rituals that occur with the onset of spring, which intersects and interacts with lots of other things going on in society. and has implications. And finally, we're worried about asynchrony. That is the fact that pollinators and flowers might not be in synchrony anymore. In other words, we have flowers that come out, they need to be pollinated by bees or flies or butterflies or insects or birds. And if these things aren't in sync anymore, because the flowers are coming up too early, or the insects are not there, then we've got a real problem. So it doesn't get a lot of attention. Well, what doesn't get a lot of attention is the fact that these changes in the biodiversity in our environment are going to affect us as humans. Of course, everyone's worried about the animals and the birds and everything else that could be threatened. But actually, we are part of that ecology. And any change in biodiversity, whether it's agriculture or wild creatures, is going to affect us. And for people that are dependent on biodiversity directly, farmers, forest collectors, pastoralists, fishermen, they're really going to be affected quite severely. Okay, so I went off to India in 2011 to look at Lantana camera and to try and do an anthropological study of how local communities are responding to this change in their environment. And the areas I worked in is on the border with Karnataka and Tamil Nadu. So it's in the south of India, up on the Deccan Plateau. So it's a little bit cooler. And it's a very forested area, as you can see here. And pretty much everywhere you go where there's forest, it's a protected area. In this case, the BR Hills is a tiger reserve. The Hills and the Calvary are wildlife sanctuaries. And there are different kinds of restrictions as a result of that. These aren't Taman Nasional. They're not national parks, but they are. The tiger reserve, in fact, is like the highest level of protection in India. So it's even more protected than a national park. And wildlife sanctuaries, less so. So this is the Hills, which is the middle one here in this picture, this orange line, Hills. And this is the capital town here in the lower right, in this area. It's got about 20 or 30 villages, and it's about the size of a Kabupaten in Indonesia. And this kind of district has a center, and this is a very old temple, a Hindu temple built, I don't know, 600-700 years ago. And it gets more than 1 million pilgrims every year come to this temple. So, this is a wildlife sanctuary with millions of people coming into it. So it's not what you would call it a typical wildlife sanctuary. It involves a lot of people. It's pretty new. And then in the surrounding hills around this town are the villages and the forests where farmers live and people gather honey and other things. And this is what Lantana looks like in those forests. So this is this wall of Lantana is about 2 to 3 meters high. And it's very thick and it's very thorny and it's nasty and nothing eats it. And in these fairly open, dry forests, this is what happens. It fills up the understory of the forest, and then you can't do anything. Now, this is the village of Kombudiki, where we did our field work. The main city there is behind these mountains, down in the valley there. This is up a little bit higher, and you can see it's a beautiful green place with lots of fields of crops here. Millet, maize, and rice, and terraces here and there, and fruit trees, and bamboo, and lots of other crops, and little houses spread around. So people don't cluster together; they live separately on their land in this valley. You'll see there's some lantana down below here on the terraces. But you have to look closely, and you'll see there's a lot of it there. So in this valley, there are two different kinds of there are two different types of people, two different ethnic groups, sukus. One are the Lingayats, who are farmers and a priestly religious caste, and then the Soliga, who are Orang Asli from this area. They're former hunter-gatherers who now are also farmers, and they have lived here forever, for a long time. The Lingayats moved in the 1930s or so, 1920s, 1930s, so fairly recently. And the Soliga sold them their land so they could move in here, but they're now the dominant population. But that valley has about 650 people. They have small gardens. They grow rice and millets, beans and pulses. They sell, they grow maize, castor, sunflower, and mustard as oil to sell. Some of the young people work in quarries or in plantations for money. They go out into the forest and they collect non-timber forest products like broomgrass or bamboo. They make baskets. They harvest honey, fruits, wild greens, and yams. They also have this thing called a PDA. So the government gives them a subsidy because they're considered very poor. So they get every month, they get a ration of rice, oil, sugar, and other things, each family. And that actually proves to be very helpful because it means that a young person can go off and work for money, and his parents or the family will be supported through the PDA, public distribution of food. Okay. So here's Lantana. It's in the Verbenaceae family, for those of you who are botanists. And this is on the left here, you have Lantana indica, which is indigenous and native to India. No problem whatsoever with that one. And then you have Lantana camera here in the middle. You may recognize these little flowers, the little bouquets, very nice, aromatic, smells great. And then this is what it does on the right here. You see a typical trail in the village, completely surrounded on both sides by Lantana camera. It was introduced in 1807 into the gardens of the British colonials in Calcutta. And it has, through the British Empire, it's spread all over the world. South Africa, India, Australia, any place you have dry, arid, dry tropics. And it's considered one of the top 5 worst invasive plants in the world. So it's gotten everywhere and it's very nasty. Now, the first picture I showed you, I took from up here somewhere, looking across the valley. So looking back at this side, which is the southern side, this is the hamlet of the Soliga. So the Lingayats live out here and the Soliga live clustered together like a kampung. And behind them, you can see all these terraces, agricultural terraces. They're all filled with Lantana. And once Lantana gets in, as you can see here on both sides of the road, it's almost impossible to get rid of. It produces so many seeds and grows so fast. If you don't weed every year in your agriculture, in your fields, if it gets established after 2 years or so, it's almost impossible to get rid of. You have to burn and burn and burn and dig them up and pull them out. And then there's still so many seeds in the soil. It's very hard. So what did we do? Initially, we went in with local researchers and like Harish here, and we set up various kinds of meetings. So we hung out, we just lived in the village for a while, hung out. We had various group interviews with both men and women separately. So we met, as you can see here, there's a meeting with women on the bottom. And then we had some informal interviews, both with men and women. We did a mapping exercise. So we sat around with big pieces of paper and drew maps of the community in the area. And people pointed out where Lantana was particularly bad. and also places where the resources that they depended on were being impacted by Lantana. And then, as you can see up top, we took forest walks and casual conversations, in this case with the men. And one of the reasons was that women now were not going into the forest anymore. And you'll see why in a minute. So this is, right. So those are the initial things we did. So our original research question then became, what's the impact of Lantana and what are people doing about it? That was our original research question. And here, so we used participant observation to follow people, describe what they do, and identify how they're responding. But of course, this raises the question of how do you know it's a response? And how do you know what they're responding to? And this is the real issue that we had to face. So here's a picture of us going out grazing with one of the elderly gentlemen from the village. And we're just on the edge of the town, of the community, going into the mountains and going into the forest. So people graze their cattle in the forest, which is not, like a tropical rainforest you find in Indonesia. It's more drier and open forest. So that's what we did. That was the participant observation. We went around following people every day as they went into the forest with their cattle. We wanted to know where they went, what they did, what did the cattle eat, and how did people move around? Where did they go and why did they go? Those were the questions we were doing. So we took notes and observations and we asked people what they were doing and why they were doing it. And so then we would sit and have a little interview. Here's Chikmada, who we're interviewing. And we would look at life history. We would explore how people explain what's happened to their landscape and the links or the chains of cause that might help to explain what people are doing. We also did some household surveys. We looked at how people's livelihoods had changed over the last couple of generations. And we did what are called herd histories. So every family that has animals, whether they're buffaloes, goats, or chickens, or cattle in this case, we would ask them about their herd history. That is, how many animals they had now, what were they going to do with them, and what did they have in the past, and why? And this was interesting because we found, of course, that people are indeed changing the kinds of animals that they're keeping as a result of various kinds of factors. So what did we find out? What did local people notice? They said that Lantana is suppressing the vegetation in their forest, which provides fodder species for their animals. So they say that the cattle have to graze longer on other food sources, and that the diet is changing and it makes cattle weak, and they're therefore vulnerable to injury or ill health. And some of those mountains are fairly steep, and it's definitely the case that some of the cattle will fall down the mountainside because they go into steep areas where there's better food and no lantana, but then they fall. So the other thing is that the grazers avoid dense thickets of lantana and some forest altogether for fear of accidentally encountering dangerous wild animals. In these forests, we have tigers, leopards, wild elephants, huge wild elephants, and bears, sloth bear, and they will attack people. They will attack animals. And as you could see from the lantana, it's so thick and so much of it that animals also get stuck and end up on the same trail as people, whereas in the past they might have their own paths. And so the number of human-wildlife conflict is increasing. And then we found out, this was very surprising to us, that people are giving up cattle because it's become too difficult to feed them. And we thought, wow, that's amazing, because this is India, the sacred cow. people really depend on cattle. So for a traditional farmer to give up cattle, that's a pretty radical change in their livelihoods and their culture. So we focused on cattle grazing then. So we really wanted to know why people are giving up cattle and how their grazing has changed as a result of Lantana. So here's an indication of the hazards of being in the forest. There you can see the tusks of a big bull elephant hidden there behind the bamboo in the Lantana. And of course, people, they could hear elephants and they could smell them, and they would have to change where they're going in the forest depending on where the elephants were. So as we've said, the number of households, the number of cattle that households has now come down. So every family used to have between 20 and 100 cattle. Now what you see is that people have maybe either none or a few, or about 10 to 20. So in the last 2 generations. And this is also seen in the state of Karnataka in general, where over a period of the last 40 years or so, the number of cattle is just steadily decreasing over time. And as people become more urbanized, and perhaps also as raising cattle becomes more difficult. But we don't know why. This was the research question. So why are people giving up cattle? So now, this is the sort of causal analysis bit here in terms of methods. So we've followed this notion of abductive reasoning from Pete Vida and Brad Walters, nicknamed ACE. But this is basically a form of causal analysis to understand the causes of something. So if we wanted to understand how Lantana affects livestock numbers, that is sort of a question of looking at how the environmental change causes a response. Now, that's a problematic question because it invites what we would call confirmation bias. We automatically link Lantana to changes in livestock numbers, when in fact there could be other things that are affecting the number of livestock. And so this approach, looking at causal analysis, means that we turn the question around and we ask, why do people have fewer cattle? And so instead of going from causes to effects, we go from effects to causes. Okay, so this is a question of the logic of a research question. In a sense, we don't want to assume the cause before we know what's causing something, right? So we're assuming here that Lantana causes the decrease in livestock, but there could be other reasons. So instead, we turn the research question around and we ask everyone, why do people have fewer cattle? Or why do they have more cattle in some cases? So that's what we start with, and we figure out what is the cause of people having fewer cattle. And this leads us to what we call multiple working hypotheses. That is, there could be a number of reasons why people have fewer cattle. They could be intersecting and interacting. And so this approach, going from responses to causes or effects to causes, allows for complexity. And this is the way we can begin to study complexity in human ecology or human ecological anthropology. So what do we find? Through analyzing herd histories for all of the families, we end up with multiple working hypotheses. So different kinds of histories of families. In some cases, we have animals being lost because they were killed by wild animals like tigers or leopards or bears, or accidents like falling. We have people talking about difficulties of grazing cattle because they have smaller families. So there's only a couple of children, and these animals need to be grazed every day. and it becomes more and more difficult as people get older to go into the forest. Also because of the threat of animals, wild animals in the forest. That also scares people. So children and a lot of the mothers that would normally graze their cattle or goats won't go into the forest anymore. The area has also gotten more restricted. The forestry department is now coming down very heavily on local people for grazing their cattle in the forest and saying they can't take them out there very long. And they're trying to discourage people from grazing in the forest. Whereas before they never did. But now that the area has become a wildlife sanctuary, there seems to be more pressure on people to not graze. And of course, if you can't get free fodder from the forest, then, you know, in this part of the area, you get into serious trouble. There's the wage migration, which, like smaller families, means that, you know, families are left. If young men go off to work, then who's going to graze cattle? Some people are deciding that they want new occupations. They're aspiring to be shopkeepers or teachers or urbanites going into the cities. And so young people really don't want to be farmers. And this is the same in Indonesia and everywhere else in the world. People don't want a rural lifestyle. They want to move to the cities. There's also been a loss of markets for cattle. Part of this has to do with the Hindu nationalist movement, the BJP that took over India in 2015, I believe, or before. And so this rise in Hindu nationalism now, which is really taking the cow as a symbol of Hinduism and using it very politically, means that people used to raise cattle and they would often sell the male calves to the market, which would end up in the slaughterhouse in places like Kerala. And actually, India is one of the biggest exporters of beef, which is very surprising. But, you know, cattle do die, and there are non-Hindus in India, many Christians and Muslims and others and Buddhists who have no problem with eating cattle or eating cows and eating beef. And there's a big market for it. But because of the political context now and the political atmosphere, it's becoming difficult to very openly sell cattle into the market. So why are there fewer cattle? So there's cash debts, loss of markets, smaller families, devaluation of rural life, urbanization, forest restrictions, migration, and Lantana. So this kind of approach leads us to a much more complex understanding of what's going on in the community. Lantana is not the only thing causing people to give up their cattle. There's lots of intersecting kinds of things. Interestingly enough, in January, there is a sudden influx of cattle into the community, which was very surprising to me. And they are, as you can see here, how dry the grasses have become during the dry season. And basically, once they harvest the crops out of the fields, they let the cattle into the fields and they eat what's ever left. Also then they provide manure for the fields for the next season. In the past, also people would then they would manage by burning fields and burning forest areas to get regrowth of grasses. And this was done very early in the dry season. So there wasn't a lot of fuel, and also things were still a bit damp, so they didn't cause forest fires. So what happened is that people now, some of the farmers are sending their cattle to the lowlands. Here you can see in the background the hills of Hills. So down in the lowland of Tamil Nadu and other places, they're sending their cattle. They have to walk them sometimes for several days to get down here. And then they are giving them to people to take care of during most of the year. And then only in after the crops have been harvested, will they bring them back to the village to graze and produce manure. But otherwise, they've taken them to areas where it's legal to graze them in the forest. It's flat, it's easier, there's less lantana, and they're paying people to take care of them. So they're literally outsourcing the care of the cows to the lowlands. And this means that some families can have more cattle than you would think. Okay, so this method then of causal analysis allows us to construct causal histories that show the intersection of these various kinds of processes, cultural processes such as the changing value of rural life, economic processes like the increased opportunities for cash through migration or moving to cities, urbanization, the demographic issues associated with smaller families, the effects of environmental change, such as the reduction in grasses, the changes in forest policy as areas become wildlife sanctuaries. And these things all interact to produce, either cattle dying, cattle being sold, or being sent to the lowlands, which in effect leads to fewer cattle in the village. So again, what we see here is that environmental changes like lantana invasion, caused by, in some cases, increasing aridity due to climate change, intersects with economic, social, and cultural and political kinds of processes that together create a situation where there are less cattle in the community. So what we learn from this is that biodiversity change is only one of many drivers of change in village India, that what we observe may be driven or constrained by one or many drivers of change, not just environmental change, that we can, through participant observation and causal analysis, we can use these methods to determine what's a response and what are its causes. And therefore, we can judge the importance of biodiversity change in the context of everything else that's going on for people. And finally, we have to say that autonomous adaptation is happening and needs to be recognized. People are responding to lantana. They're using it for fencing. They are changing the way that they do their livelihoods as a result of it there. Some people are developing furniture like similar to rotan, furniture from lantana, which they're trying to sell, but that's a very difficult, labor-intensive and specialized thing. So not everyone can get involved in that. And people are learning to burn it and keep it out of their fields. And in some cases, as we've seen, people are giving up activities that take place in the forest, whether it's collecting medicinal plants, wild foods, fruits, honey, or grazing animals as a result. So if you want more information about this, you can check our CBCD website at Kent on human adaptation to biodiversity change. We produced a special issue in Ambio that looks at human adaptation to biodiversity change in the Anthropocene. So this case study is there, along with studies done of fish and other kinds of creatures, plants and animals around the world, and how people are adapting to them. And the book Climate Cultures has a chapter in there that I wrote about India and about about learning to graze and following people around and asking questions about what they're doing and why, and whether or not it's related to climate change. Okay. This is from the AAA, which is the American Anthropological Association. They did a special report on climate change, and they recommended that anthropologists are really well placed to understand the entanglement of changes affecting human communities and the obstacles to global sustainability, which are crucial in crafting effective action on global environmental change. Okay, so let's get back to the final comment on wicked problems. And how they affect, and climate change impacts. So adaptation to climate change is a wicked problem because of the uncertainty of impacts. That is, in terms of impacts, we can have shocks like extreme weather, extreme events like, prolonged floods or long periods of heat. And so there's extreme things. And then we can have surprises. So things that we really haven't predicted at all. We don't know, literally, we don't know that they're going to happen because they are indeed surprises. So that makes it much more difficult. It's also a wicked problem because adapting is to a moving target. So responding or coping to change is always to a moving target. The environment is always changing. So there's no end to adaptation. And people are constantly having to adapt. You don't really get to a place where you are finished adapting. And this is the key, that we're always on the pathway to adaptation. That's a moving target. It's like development, sustainable development. Sustainable development is a myth because there's no way to know that you're being sustainable if the environment is always changing. And this is one of the real difficulties people have in trying to implement sustainable development. It's also wicked because there are multiple causes for any observable action or event that we can see, whether it's people changing their grazing patterns or giving up cattle. We understand that cosmologies, worldviews, belief systems help people to interpret and explain changes, but they're poor guides to actions taken, right? So despite the fact that we recognize that ideology and belief are important in understanding people's behavior, they often are not followed or compromised or subverted due to material issues. Finally, participant observation and ACE, or causal analysis, are methods to determine what's a response and what are its causes, and therefore we can judge the importance of climate change impacts. Okay, so again, it's a question of understanding the balance. What's more important in terms of changes and drivers of change? And one of our responses is to use, again, multiple working hypotheses. That is to come up with many possible answers to the question of why people are doing what they're doing. And like Sherlock Holmes, that great detective, we can go explore all of these possibilities and try and come up with answers to the perennial anthropological question of why is it that people do what they do? Okay, so I will stop there. And I hope you understood all that. I hope I wasn't talking too quick and it wasn't too complicated, but it is complicated. And I'm happy to answer any questions anyone might have.
Ya, terima kasih Pak Raj. Thank you so much for your very, very clear explanation and description. I hope the student and the audience here will catch it very also clear. Now, there must also be a question from the student or the audience who already raised up hand. Yes, Aditya. Yes, Adit, please, your time is now.
Yeah, thanks, Bu Budi dan Pak Raj. Yeah, I think one of the reasons that why people didn't care a lot about climate change is because the big impact of climate change are something that we can't feel directly now. like you said that the impact we don't know when it could it could happen. Especially people who live in a rural area. And what do you think about it, and how we can convince them? Yeah, thanks. That's my yeah.
Well, I don't know. I mean, once people start realizing that their environment is changing, then maybe they'll be more amenable to understanding that climate change could be an impact. But, you know, there's so many other factors. I mean, for years, where I was working in Kalimantan, you know, we dealt with El Nino and La Nina, you know, and that cycle and the effects that has on people, and adaptation. And, you know, the climate change affects the El Ninos. So the periodical droughts and fires, or the periodical floods and storms, and those become more extreme. So if people recognize that these, you know, these events that occur every few years are getting worse, then we have an opportunity to try and explain that that probably is due to climate change. But as I said, even when you're dealing with weather, is it going to rain today or not? It's very hard to say that that's due to climate change, you know, because everyday variability is normal, right? And in Indonesia, you guys know this better than anyone else because of El Nino, that some years it's going to be a drought, some years it's going to be too much rain. And it happens every decade. Maybe you get a very bad one. But, you know, so disentangling the causes of weather changes is very difficult. So it's not surprising people would have a tough time relating to a concept like climate change. I mean, you know, you can show them the data and see what they say, but in terms of rising CO2 in the atmosphere. But it may be that people are beginning to recognize things, especially in Indonesia, where you have, you know, people close to the sea. They might see in the oceans in terms of fish and bleaching of corals and other changes in the marine environment. They may be observing changes there that they don't understand or explain. But, you know, I'm not too worried about convincing everyone that there's climate change. I think, you know, it's hard to do, and because if they don't see anything that looks like climate change, it's very hard to convince people that, you know, it's like trying to convince people that there are dragons, of which there are, of course, but maybe not where they are. You know, so again, it's as abstract as any other abstract concept, isn't it, for most people? If you know, you can show them pictures of melting glaciers, and you can show them pictures of the Arctic ice or the sea level rising, and extreme you know, in other places where it's quite obvious. But sometimes it's hard to really internalize it and feel like it's happening if there's nothing changing around you.
I think a little bit following Aditya's question, is there baseline which you can say there's a changing in the climate or whatsoever?
Yeah. I mean, generally, the definition of climate is the average temperature and rainfall over a 30-year period, right? So you take the average over 30 years, and that's considered the climate. So then you look at 30-year blocks, and that's how you can tell. I mean, you see, because climate is really something very abstract.
Exactly.
You know, we have weather and we have seasons. And in this part of the world, we have El Nino. So we have things that happen over multiple years. But climate really is a very abstract concept. I mean, we know that if you live in a desert, you have a certain climate. You live in a rainforest, you have a certain climate. But, you know, it's hard to, in any particular place, it's only when you compare places far away that you get a sense of climatic differences. But but it's really just 30 years. I mean, we've defined, atmospheric scientists and climatologists have defined climate as a 30-year average. So, which is about a generation, right?
Or in the society, do you need to find the basic line from before
It's
and
changing
after?
baselines. Many of you who've studied conservation uses the idea of shifting baselines because, you know, we're growing up and you talk to kids now, they don't know what it was like in the past. This is normal for them. You know, it's like in England, people talk about the fact that 30, 40 years ago, there was so much bird song. You know, it was deafening, the number of birds every morning. And now I think there's a lot of bird song here, but of course I've been to the rainforest in Kalimantan and Java. I know what bird song sounds like in the morning. But here nobody, unless you're very old, you don't know that 60, 70 years ago, there were huge numbers of songbirds every morning. So that's the problem. There is no baseline.
Exactly. The
baseline is wherever you are.
Yeah.
So it's not a question of trying to get back to something.
No.
I think this idea of rewilding, or you can't really return to the past, but going forward, we can ensure that, you know, our environment is safe for us to live in and can support us and can allow for lots of other animals and plants to live as well.
Okay. Parash, there's a question in the chat room. Population is the biggest.
Pollution.
Can you read it?
Yeah. In India, how to mitigate pollution from industry to solve indigenous conflict with wild animals and take small action with nature. Ooh, yes. Yeah. Okay. You know, some people say that carbon is pollution as well, but let's think of the normal sense of pollution from factories and this is terrible in Delhi, where my family lives, my father's family. You know, every January they get this smog, this toxic fog that comes in and you can't see in front of your face, basically. Really bad, very bad. So, I mean, you know, that's what governments are for, really. I mean, we in the United States and in the UK, we've had Clean Air Acts. In legislation, the government has created since the 1960s and 1970s, which has driven coal out of cities, etc. And you know, for that, it's government regulation, and then, as we all know, it has to be implemented. But I think in many cases, you know, that's not so difficult to implement in terms of smokestacks and pollution checks. You know, you can find the source of pollution usually when it's in the air. Stuff getting into water is harder. Yeah, exactly. It can be illegal dumping and that kind of thing. But you know, smokestacks are easy to see, and pollution going in, you know, they can monitor it. So I think legislation is really the only way to go with industrial pollution. You know, what I mean, obviously communities can protest, and many do. And, you know, as long as, well, one hopes that their voices are heard, even if they're not acted on. But one thing that anthropologists and others, community organizers, can do is to, you know, is to document these cases. You know, now it's great with video. You can just make a film, get the community to make a film about the situation that they're dealing with in terms of pollution, and put it on the internet and get people to watch it, and maybe something will happen.
So community development is very important for understanding also climate change, I think.
Well, yeah, I suppose so. I mean, community development in the sense of developing communities.
Or participation community.
Oh, yeah. Okay, absolutely. Absolutely. No, I think the biggest problem we have is because climate is a abstract global concept, global effect, global phenomena, which has local effects. And those, as we're just saying, local effects can vary tremendously. You know, people say, you know, the places to go to see climate change are the mountains and the Arctic and the Pacific Islands. But I think people in Kalimantan probably are noticing changes in the tropical forests, in the birds and the animals and the plants, in the weather, that probably are caused by climate change to some extent. Again, you don't want to necessarily, as much as it's a big problem, it interacts with other problems that we still have: inequality, poverty, lack of development, problems in healthcare, you know. So all of these things interact. But yes, communities absolutely necessary, I think. I mean, and that's our strength.
Yeah.
Nobody else listens to communities.
Except us. Yeah.
I'm joking, of course, plenty of people do.
Yeah. Me too. Yeah. Andit, do you want to ask something or the other? Hello?
I don't have any questions at the moment.
Okay. Good.
Okay. Who wants to ask some question? Oh, Pahmi, I think. Pahmi boleh bicara dalam bahasa Indonesia?
Boleh.
Yeah. Pahmi? Or Jonathan? Because actually there are several cases affected by climate change, but I don't know why students do not want to say things.
Well, that's okay. I mean, I'm sure they're a little bit shy, but just write it in the chat.
Yeah. Pahmi, silakan loh, Pahmi.
And I'm happy to answer any questions. How many of you are thinking of doing research on climate change? I'm interested in that.
I don't know. Adakah yang sedang penelitian climate change, kata Pak Raj, karena Pak Raj tahun 2023 akan juga datang ke Indonesia, mungkin bisa kita melakukan penelitian bersama ya Pak Raj. Kita bisa ke...
You can do it very easy to set up a project that involves lots of students. We do it here in Kent all the time. If you look at our Kent 50 farmers archive, we had a lovely project where we interviewed 50 farmers around Canterbury, and it was all done by the students and undergraduate students, not masters. And a big team that went out and interviewed as many people as we could, using more, not questionnaires, but real anthropology as opposed to sociology or something like that. So,
I think you can share the data, what have done by the Kent University student, so we can learn.
I'll just show you.
Please do.
Just share the website, and then you can get a sense of what that looks like.
Nah, saudara-saudara sekalian, Pak Raj akan memberikan website dari hasil penelitian mahasiswa dengan dosen yang kemudian bisa menjadi inspirasi buat kita untuk melakukan penelitian sejenis atau hampir sama atau berbeda, tapi paling tidak dalam kerangka climate change. Karena penelitian ini sangat
well, yeah, it's actually a very good okay. Here, let me just share this. You get a sense of what this is about. So here is the archive, 50 Farmers' Tales, and it has lots of interesting things here. So here's Kent, here's Canterbury here.
Yeah.
And these are the locations of all the farmers we interviewed. So 50 farmers. And you can click on this. So that's an image. So
is it open access, Raj?
Yeah, absolutely. It's all open access. There's lots of videos here, so you can see. There's a film we made, which is about 45 minutes, and then these are shorter films, And then a lot of the interviews we filmed. So here are all the different farmers that we talked to. We filmed only some, but we audio recorded all of them. Right. So here you can let's see here, making us my interview archive. So here we have all the different farmers. And so here's Bob's page. So Bob Akehurst, and we have some information about him and who when they were interviewed. And then we have the transcript is here. So in English, this is the interview
great.
transcript.
Yes,
And then
children, please do look at this.
And then we have the audio. So here we have the audio. You can listen to the actual interview. And then these are some pictures that Bob gave us of his farm, the history of his farm. So the question here, so this study was based on the idea of that the University of Kent had its 50th anniversary. So it's a fairly new university in 2015. So we interviewed 50 farmers as part of that. And we asked them, how have their farms and farming changed over the last 50 years? It was a very simple question that we started with. So the idea was we were tapping into farmers' knowledge of how their environment and how their farms had changed in the last 50 years and why. Again, it was a simple question of getting local farmers' perspectives on change and how they explain it.
Okay.
And you can do the same thing in Bandung.
Yes, of course.
Again, because it's a question where we ask about what's changed and why, climate change can come into that, or maybe not. You know, for some regulations, all the various diseases, we had foot and mouth disease, we had BSE, you know, there were like animal pathologies that affected a lot of farmers, invasive species, theft, all sorts of interesting things. So like the kind of analysis I just showed you for India, we start with the basic question of what's changing for farmers, and then we ask why. Now, if we were some other kind of scientist, we might collect all sorts of data and we would do statistical correlations and we would try and figure out what correlates with change. So let's look at the GIS stuff. So here, this shows if you were to look at this map here, you have a GIS that shows you how grassland has changed between 1961 and 2008. So not exactly the same 50 years we were interested in, but it's good enough to see areas that are purple here have been lost from arable grassland, and the green is gained. And same here, you have arable changes. We have urbanization. Here you can see how the urban areas in Kent have gotten bigger. Areas have converted to urban. So in fact, here you can see land use changes. But as I always say, these kinds of GIS analysis, they're just based on correlations in space. You know, what we would do is go ask people, not do statistical correlations, but go down and ask people on the ground, what's happening, what's changed for you, and why? Why do you think, what's going on your farms? And of course, farmers should know what they're doing and why they're doing it. And building up an explanation from what people tell us is the basis of anthropological theory, isn't it? And anthropological ideas. So that's what we did. We could do the same thing in Bandung. We could go around and ask farmers or people who are working the land in some way and collect a huge amount of data about change in the Bandung area over the last 50 or 60, 70 years. And we could begin to see also what's happening now, but also the history of change. So one of the interesting things was that we found out that lots of farmers are doing lots of different things. Many of them have given up dairy cattle and are having beef cattle. Many are turning their barns into businesses or renting out space in their farms or setting up festivals or markets or all sorts of things. Because being a farmer is hard and it's difficult to survive. But and because of climate change and people wanting to rewild or create more woodlands, there's all sorts of experiments that are going on, that are really interesting to find out about. Like there's a guy that we know, the price of milk here is so cheap that it costs more to make it than you get in the supermarket. And so like farmers are like, why bother having dairy cattle if milk is cheaper than it costs? And so a lot of people are giving up that, or they're dependent on the government for a subsidy to make up the difference between the price the supermarket buys and the cost of producing it. So one farmer has decided he's taking his milk and he's making vodka. And I didn't know you could make vodka from milk, but apparently you can. And so he's it's completely changed the business. But these are the kinds of experiments that we're finding in the countryside around Kent.
Very interesting.
We have more wine now. We have incredible vineyards that are spreading all across southern England because of climate change. It's warmer here, it's drier. We now have 300-400 vineyards and wine producers in southern England alone. And the French are buying up all the land around Canterbury from Champagne. So everyone who likes to drink champagne, it's called Champagne because it comes from the province of Champagne in France. But there it's getting too hot and too dry. And they don't have enough space to grow grapes for the demand, the global demand. So they're buying up land in England, which is around Canterbury is also chalky soils like you have in Champagne. And the big companies are buying up huge amounts of land. And they're going to be growing English sparkling wine since they can't call it champagne. But it's really good. It's very good. And so that's an effect of climate change.
But is it not that raises another problem, because they are going to buy the land in the UK? So then I don't know whether it's a problem or not.
Many farmers are happy to sell their farms because their kids don't want to be farmers anymore, just like in India.
Just like in Indonesia.
You have in a lot of these interviews on the 50 Farmers Archive, plenty of farmers were talking about the fact that they didn't know what was going to happen to their farms because their kids went to university and went off, and nobody wants to be a farmer. So in some cases they rent their land. So they'll keep their house because that's where they live and they want to stay, and maybe the kids want to live in the house, but they don't want to be farmers. So they rent the land to somebody else. So in some cases you have some farms expanding because they can rent land fairly cheaply. And so you have fewer farmers in charge of larger areas of land. So consolidation, right? And some people just sell up. They sell all of their land and their house and they move and go to Spain or retire. And then the land gets either built. The land usually is zoned, right? So you can't just take a farm and start putting condominiums on it or houses because it's zoned agricultural. But sometimes they do get permission. And so you make a lot of money selling your fields and building houses on them, as I'm sure they do in Indonesia as well.
Yes, exactly. Then there is
Urban sprawl.
urban sprawl, yes. And there's another issue later coming on. Not only biodiversity, but cultural diversity, because many people from out of England come to England and the culture become more multi, I think. Don't you think so?
Well, that's why we had this whole Brexit thing, right? You know, so.
Exactly. Now, otherwise we discuss. No, ada student who want to ask? Pak Raj sudah menjelaskan begitu jelasnya loh. Silahkan Jo kalau mau bertanya.
Audi dulu tadi. Saya mau nanya.
Oh, ada Audi.
Audi.
Silahkan Audi, saya tidak bisa lihat tangannya. Ya Audi, silahkan Audi.
Oh ya, ya. Terima kasih Bu Wati udah nyediain kesempatannya. And I would like to say thank you to Mr. Raj for the presentation. And I would like to continue off of Aditya's question earlier about the climate change and your previous statement about it's hard to convince people of something that they cannot see, such as climate change. And I really believe that is to be the case because there's a lot of people that basically basically are not convinced of something if it is not seen with their eyes. And do anthropologists, ecological anthropologists, have the responsibility to convince them to their fullest extent about the changes that are happening, which they might not believe, if it would maybe affect their livelihood for their future, or we just not convince them at all. That might be my question. Thank you.
It's a very good question. I don't know. I suppose as a scientist or an academic, a scholar, our job obviously is to produce knowledge, right? Is to produce information that is valid, as truthful as we can get. You know, for whatever methods we use. You know, and obviously there's lots of problems with that, but we try and we want to produce good information. And we have to produce not just good information, but good arguments about particular positions. So does climate change exist? And is obviously a big question. And I don't know how many of you have seen the film made by Al Gore in 2007, An Inconvenient Truth. An Inconvenient Truth. That was a film that he made to try and convince Americans that climate change was real. And you can see it on YouTube. And that was really effective. That film changed the whole climate, literally changed the climate in America. And really, for most climate deniers, were completely shut up after that. But it took a long time, you know, and it was something like that which swung a lot of people's opinions, because it just, if you look at that film and the way it's constructed, it's very well done. And it's full of very visual information and effects of climate change. You know, so you could, if you take that film and maybe somebody has put Indonesian subtitles on it, then maybe that would be interesting to show and get comments from. I mean, that's now 15 years old. And obviously, I think there was a more recent one that they produced. But the power of television and films are not to be, because those are effective medium for convincing the public. I don't think it's our job as ecological anthropologists to convince the public. I mean, we can only do the research and publish it and try and promote our research that we do. But those are, the research we do is much more specific and narrow. But we certainly have a responsibility ethically to not do any harm to the people we work with. And sometimes that means that might mean also helping them or helping people to understand situations that are going on around them that they may not know about. And so I remember in the villages in Kalimantan being asked about logging, because the interior of Balungan at the time, there was no logging. People knew about logging because it was down on the coast. And I did the best I could to explain what it meant and what happens. And a friend of mine actually did this in the Pacific. He made a video of people in the community talking about what happened when they sold their rights over their land to a logging company. In other words, they gave a concession. He made a film. All he did was film people in the community talking about what happened. And then he took that film and he traveled around and he showed it in other communities. And that was very effective because communities then could see what other communities, what happened to them. And in many cases, it wasn't very good. They were promised a school, they were promised a hospital, they were promised roads, and a lot of stuff didn't happen, and their forests were wrecked. It had all those impacts. Well, we know all about that now. But, sometimes maybe a film with other Indonesians talking about the local impacts of climate change where they are, maybe that would help to convince other people that this is real. You know what I mean? So, but I don't think it's really, obviously you can do it and as an anthropologist, as a filmmaker, as an activist, that's fantastic. But I think as a sort of our first job is to be good researchers and good scholars and produce really useful and helpful information. And that might mean conveying what a community thinks to policymakers or to funders or to other communities. Sorry, a bit long-winded response, but anyway. It's a good question. It's a good question. Anyone else? We've got about 10 minutes or so.
Siapa lagi? Ya, siapa lagi terakhir?
Saya mau bertanya, Bu.
Joe?
Yeah.
Not too long because we only have 10 minutes left or 7 minutes even.
Okay. So Paraj, I just want to ask about talking about India, things like that. I can't help but think about their beliefs or religious beliefs, and does it actually contribute to how they treat their environment or their relationship with their environment, especially now, like the previous questions about mitigating the pollution from industry, things like that. Does their religious beliefs or the locals, they have their certain belief that actually help them to mitigate all this stuff, pollution, and or does their beliefs actually have explained stuff about climate change, but not climate changes like we academics understand it, but they have their own locals or traditional understanding about it. So maybe that's why they actually don't need an explanation about it, because they actually already know, but it's just a different concept or understanding from us.
Oh, no, that's absolutely right. Absolutely right. Many peoples have different explanations for change that's occurring in their environment. I'll give you a nice example from China. There's one of the mountain areas on the border between, is it China and Nepal or China and Bhutan? Those communities there, their glaciers are melting. But their belief, the local belief, is that those mountains are gods. And that the glaciers melting means that the gods are unhappy with them and are leaving. So in their cosmology, what they are fearing is that the protector gods that used to ensure their survival are leaving, literally melting away. And this has really caused a psychological crisis. So people, imagine that you kind of had a visible evidence of your religion disappearing, and where people put their faith. And what they believe is that the gods are leaving because they have done something wrong. So in many traditional religious systems, which we call kin-centric, nature and culture are not divided, and the environment responds to us as our social behaviors, and also we have to behave in a certain way so that we get crops, etc. Hence spells and prayers and rituals when we plant rice to ensure a good harvest, etc., etc., etc. So for these people, the fact that the gods were leaving meant that they looked at themselves and they blamed themselves. They blamed themselves for, in the past 10, 20 years, becoming more open to the outside world, allowing tourists to come in and climb the mountains, and leaving all this garbage around. So local people blamed themselves for climate change, which made sense in their cosmological conception, but in many ways is very tragic. It's not their fault from our perspective, right? That glaciers are melting because it's getting warmer. And so these kinds of things are really important. And in India, the local people there, the Soliga, some of them said to me that this is the Lord Shani, who is a kind of devil, kind of god within Hinduism. Lord Shani had come to their land and was promoting the Lantana. And they, again, kind of blamed themselves. They said, we don't know what we've done for Lord Shani to come like this and ruin our forests and ruin our land. And for many, especially the older generation who are more devout, I would say, there was a real crisis, it's in a psychological sense too, a real challenge. So I think you're absolutely right. People are going to interpret changes according to their own cosmologies and religious systems. And this is extremely important to understand in our work as anthropologists. And of course, it will influence for many people how they respond.
Raj, is it something to do with ethnic and emic perspective?
Well, that's one way to think about it. Yes, there will always be local explanations which may differ from your explanation as an outside scientist or somebody who uses climate data to explain things. But obviously local people and local communities have their own conceptions of what's going on, and they often, the changes in their environment they can explain, and other changes they can't. They're beyond their understanding of, they have no way to explain them. But in many traditional societies where people see themselves as intimately related to the environment or a part of the environment, they don't make a distinction between nature and culture like we do in the West or in many places, that, you know, they're always going to see themselves as somehow linked to these changes, either in a good or a bad way. I think it's really tragic that from our perspective, you know, global emissions, which we think are causing climate change, are really the result of the developed world polluting the atmosphere. And these poor indigenous peoples who've lived there for thousands of years and have a very beautiful kind of existence and relationship to the environment are blaming themselves for what's happening.
So sad.
I mean, some people would argue that we need a religious transformation to solve the climate crisis. But as I was saying in this lecture, it's more complicated than that. There is no one solution. That's why it's a wicked problem. There's no one solution to solving the climate crisis. Yes, it'd be nice if we changed our beliefs in the West and we're less worried about consuming products and driving our cars everywhere and used less carbon. That would be great. That would help. But there's so many other things going on, and so many other intersecting causes that make it a very difficult thing to solve. So always remember that there's never just one solution. There's no magic bullet because things are caused by multiple things that intersect. And the best we can do as scholars is try and untangle those, tell the stories, the complex stories of why people are doing what they're doing, how their environment is changing, how they're responding to it, how they think about it, what it's conceptualized, what the impacts are, and how those changes are intersecting with other kinds of changes that have to do with economics or politics or culture or changes in society. It's not an easy thing. You need lots of people to help you do it. So gather your friends and set off and try and do something like this. I think it's a worthwhile research topic.
It is a homework for all of us, especially for anthropologists. Do you think so?
Well, yeah, I think well, gosh, I mean, all of these problems in the end, they all intersect, whether you're interested in gender or environmental change or inequality or development or poverty. It's all of a piece, right? So it's a complex picture. And I think the more that there's, anthropologists have tended to be very individualistic and very sort of the lone anthropologist out in his kampong. But I think these days we need many disciplines working together with communities, with people, not studying them, but working with them, better understand their own environments and what's happening. And I think through that kind of participatory, collaborative research, we can still produce really important and interesting information, and we can tell the stories of people as they are dealing with change, this complex kind of change in a very complex world. And we need those stories.
Very clear, saudara-saudara, sangat amat jelas. Pak Raj sudah menjelaskan tepat sampai jam 5:30. Pak Raj, sharp.
Sudahlah.
5:30 persis. Thank you so much. Terima kasih banyak for your class today. We hope can still discuss with you in another time and with another issue or the same issue. Ya, saudara-saudara. Terima kasih untuk Pak Raj. Kita akan banyak belajar lagi, kita akan banyak diskusi dengan Pak Raj di kemudian hari. Mudah-mudahan kita bisa penelitian kolaborasi juga bersama Pak Raj dan Ken University karena ini suatu pekerjaan yang menantang kita untuk lebih aware dengan situasi sosial kita sendiri dan iklim kita sendiri. Iklim kita bersama maksud saya. Baik, karena sudah 5:30, Pak Raj, thank you so much. Ada
You're very
yang mau
welcome.
disampaikan? Bu Rina, ada yang mau disampaikan? Bu Rina sudah nah itu.
Ya, terima kasih Pak Raj sudah banyak memberikan ilmu kepada kami dalam 3 pertemuan ini. Mudah-mudahan nanti ke depan kita bisa kembali ya bekerja sama gitu dalam tadi riset dan lain-lain. Terima kasih.
Kita rancang penelitian ya.
Iya.
Okay.
Oke, Raj, thank you so much.
All right.
See you
Selamat
soon.
jalan semua.
Ya.
Selamat.